Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into a world where silk hangs heavy in torchlight, where incense curls into the dark air, and where you, yes, you, stand at the threshold of a royal wedding that feels less like a celebration and more like a protective ritual. You can almost feel the weight of the veil before it even touches your hair, layered and deliberate, designed not for beauty, but for survival. Somewhere behind the music and murmured prayers, there's a truth that feels unsettling. This wedding isn't just about love or alliance, and you probably won't survive this night if the veil fails to do its job. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, drop a comment with your location and local time, because it's always strangely comforting to know where in the world you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand in a time when people don't think of danger as abstract. Danger has a personality, it has intentions, it listens, and most importantly, it watches. In the ancient world, especially in royal and noble circles, a bride walking uncovered toward her future wasn't just vulnerable, she was exposed in ways that modern instincts barely register. You're taught from childhood that unseen forces linger everywhere. Spirits resent happiness, gods test arrogance, envious humans carry thoughts sharp enough to wound. The veil in this mindset isn't decoration. It's a barrier, a movable wall between a fragile human moment and a universe that loves to interfere. You can trace this belief back thousands of years. In ancient Mesopotamia, veiling wasn't optional for elite women. It was codified in law. The Assyrian legal codes spelled out exactly who could wear a veil and who could not, because covering the head marked not just status, but protection. A royal bride was thought to be particularly appetizing to hostile forces, her fertility, her lineage, her future children, all shimmering like open invitations. The veil functioned like a spiritual firewall. One mainstream historical fact often overlooked is that these early veils were sometimes blessed or ritually prepared, treated almost like armor before the ceremony. This wasn't Fashion Week. This was spiritual combat, just with better textiles. You feel the atmosphere shift when you enter ancient temples where weddings took place under the watchful eyes of gods who were loving, yes, but also notoriously temperamental. In these spaces, joy was dangerous because it attracted attention. The happier the moment, the more likely something or someone would want to ruin it. That's why veils were believed to confuse malevolent spirits. If they couldn't see the bride clearly, they couldn't target her precisely. Think of it as cosmic misdirection. And yes, it sounds a bit like hiding from monsters by standing very still, which, spoiler alert, never works in movies, but people were committed to the idea. There's a quirky, slightly unsettling tidbit that pops up again and again in early folklore. Some cultures believed spirits counted features, eyes, mouths, hairlines. If those were obscured, the spirit might lose count, grow frustrated, and wander off. Imagine a demon squinting at a veiled bride like, wait, how many eyes does this one have? And just giving up. It's almost funny, until you remember people truly believed their lives depended on this kind of confusion. And for royal brides, whose marriages could alter the fate of kingdoms, the stakes felt terrifyingly real. You also have to remember that royal weddings were public events. Crowds gathered, eyes stared. Not all of them friendly. The idea of the evil eye wasn't metaphorical. It was a widely accepted explanation for sudden illness, miscarriage, or death. A bride stepping forward unveiled was thought to invite envy so intense it could physically harm her. The veil acted like a filter, dulling the sharp edge of other people's desires and resentments. Historians still argue whether this belief originated primarily from spiritual superstition or from very real social anxiety about assassination and sabotage disguised as mysticism. And honestly, when you think about it, the line between superstition and practical fear was thin. Royal families had enemies, lots of them. Poison, curses, and bad luck were often lumped together in the same mental category. If a bride collapsed after her wedding, people didn't ask, was it arsenic? They asked, who looked at her too hard? The veil gave everyone plausible reassurance. If something went wrong, at least you'd followed protocol. At least you hadn't tempted fate by showing too much confidence. You start to notice how the veil changes the bride's presence. She becomes less individual, more symbolic, less human, more vessel. That too was part of the protection. Many belief systems held that gods and spirits targeted individuals, not symbols. By obscuring her face, the bride temporarily stepped out of herself and into a role: wife, queen, mother-to-be. It's easier to strike a person than an idea. The veil turned her into an idea, a moving emblem, a concept wrapped in linen and silk. There's a quiet irony here that feels very on-brand for human history. The same object meant to protect the bride also erased her. You can sense it when you imagine standing under that fabric, hearing everything but seeing little, breathing through layers that smell faintly of incense and dye. It's safe, they tell you, safer than being seen. And maybe it was, but safety came at the cost of visibility, autonomy, and identity, concepts that weren't exactly top priorities in dynastic politics. In some early royal traditions, the veil wasn't lifted until the bride crossed a literal threshold, out of the temple into a new home or into the groom's private space. Until then, she existed in a liminal state, not maiden, not wife, not fully herself. This in-between status was thought to be especially dangerous. Liminal spaces, after all, are where spirits love to hang out. Crossroads, doorways, weddings. The veil served as a kind of passport through this unstable moment, signaling to the universe, she's under protection, keep moving. You might be tempted to think this is all a bit dramatic, and sure, from a modern couch with a blanket and maybe a cat nearby, it does sound excessive. But then again, this was a world without antibiotics, without security teams, without forensic science. When bad things happened, they happened suddenly and without explanation. Ritual was the closest thing people had to control. And royal families, obsessed with continuity, leaned into anything that promised stability, even if it came wrapped in superstition. By the time you drift toward the end of this section, you realize something quietly unsettling. The veil wasn't about modesty yet. That came later. At its core, the earliest royal wedding veil was a shield, a warning sign, a spiritual "do not disturb" placed over a human being at the most vulnerable moment of her life. And once you see it that way, it's hard to unsee, because if a simple piece of fabric could hold back curses, envy, and divine jealousy, what else might it have been hiding? You keep moving forward without pause, because in this world, hesitation is its own kind of danger. The veil still rests over your face, and now you begin to understand another reason it was never meant to be transparent. This isn't just about spirits anymore. This is about confusion, deliberate, strategic confusion, and the quiet hope that if no one can be entirely sure who you are, they might hesitate long enough for you to survive. In many royal cultures, especially across ancient Rome and parts of early Greece, the bride's veil wasn't even white. It was flame-colored, a deep reddish orange meant to blur identity and signal transformation. You are not meant to look like yourself. You are meant to look like a bride. That distinction matters more than comfort, more than romance, because when a woman married into a powerful family, she didn't just gain status, she inherited enemies, and enemies prefer certainty. There's a mainstream historical fact that still makes historians pause. In Roman weddings, the bride's veil, called the flammeum, was so visually dominant that it obscured facial recognition from a distance. This wasn't accidental. Roman writers openly described marriage as a legal and social transfer of authority, and any moment of transfer was considered unstable. Instability attracted interference. The veil created plausible doubt. If someone wanted to grab, curse, or attack the bride during a procession, they'd better be absolutely sure they had the right woman, and for just a few critical moments they couldn't be. You walk through crowds where multiple women may be dressed similarly, all veiled, all moving in ritualized patterns. The confusion isn't limited to outsiders. Even the groom, in some traditions, was not meant to see his bride clearly until a specific moment. This wasn't about romance or suspense. It was about preventing premeditated rejection or public humiliation if something about the bride, her height, her face, her health, didn't meet expectations. Historians still argue whether this practice protected women from shame or primarily protected political agreements from falling apart in public. And then there's the darker layer, the one people don't like to talk about out loud. Kidnapping. Royal brides were valuable commodities and rival factions knew it. Snatching a bride could derail alliances, provoke wars, or force renegotiations. Veiling, combined with identical dress and controlled movement, reduced the risk. You can't steal what you can't confidently identify. It's not foolproof, but neither are modern security protocols, and this was the best option available at the time. There's a quirky, almost absurd tidbit buried in medieval chronicles. Some royal processions deliberately included decoy brides, women dressed identically, veiled the same way, walking at staggered intervals. Officially they were attendants, unofficially they were insurance policies. If you're imagining a would-be kidnapper second-guessing himself as 5 nearly identical figures glide past, congratulations, you're thinking exactly like a medieval court planner. Elegant paranoia, he was still paranoia. The veil also played a role in neutralizing recognition magic. Yes, that's a real belief, not just fantasy filler. In several early European traditions, it was thought that knowing someone's face, or worse, their true name, gave you power over them. Spells required specificity. Curses needed a target. By hiding the bride's face, you denied hostile forces the clarity they needed. It's the supernatural equivalent of refusing to tag your location online. Oversharing has always been dangerous. People just used to blame witches instead of algorithms. You notice how this belief intersects with another anxiety. Mistaken identity was preferable to correct identity. If a demon, rival, or assassin struck the wrong person, the ritual still technically worked. Cold logic, yes, but royal marriages weren't built on warmth. They were built on survival calculus. The veil created a buffer zone of uncertainty where outcomes could be redirected, delayed, or diffused. Even failure could be managed if it was ambiguous enough. At the same time, the veil protected the groom from himself. In arranged royal marriages, attraction was not guaranteed. Seeing the bride too early could trigger doubt, disappointment, or outright refusal. And refusal had consequences. Wars have started over less. By delaying recognition, the ritual forced commitment first, and evaluation second. Once vows were spoken, faces became secondary. This wasn't romance, it was contract enforcement dressed up as ceremony. There's a strange psychological comfort in anonymity, even forced anonymity. You can feel it beneath the veil. Expectations soften, judgment blurs. For a brief window, you are less scrutinized, less evaluated, less owned. That may be why some accounts suggest brides felt safer veiled, not just physically, but emotionally. Being unseen meant being unassessed, and in a world obsessed with lineage and perfection, that was rare mercy. Still, not everyone agreed on the veil's purpose. Some ancient commentators dismissed the supernatural explanations entirely, arguing that confusion rituals were purely social tools, not spiritual ones. Others insisted the opposite, that any political benefit was secondary to metaphysical necessity. Historians still argue whether the original motivation leaned more toward crowd control or cosmic defense, and the truth probably sits uncomfortably in between. As you move forward, the veil no longer feels like a simple piece of fabric. It's a calculated blur, a legal maneuver, a spiritual smokescreen. It hides you, not because you are weak, but because being known, clearly, publicly, and at the wrong moment, has always been one of the most dangerous things a royal bride could be. And somewhere in that realization, you start to suspect this tradition didn't survive for centuries by accident. It survived because confusion, when properly staged, can be more powerful than any weapon. You move forward again, and this time the veil feels heavier, not because of fabric, but because of what it quietly refuses to reveal. Beneath it, entire bloodlines are being negotiated, and not all of them are healthy. Royal marriages are supposed to secure the future, but you quickly realize they're also exercises in damage control. The veil, once a spiritual shield and a tool of confusion, now becomes something more uncomfortable, a way to delay the truth. Dynasties are obsessed with purity, yet they are built on repetition. Cousins marry cousins, uncles marry nieces. The family tree tightens until it resembles a knot, and knots hide pressure until they snap. You don't need modern genetics to notice something is wrong. People in the past absolutely did. They noticed recurring illnesses, strange behaviors, children who didn't survive infancy. They just didn't have vocabulary for it. So instead of chromosomes, they talked about fate, curses, or weak blood. And when a royal bride arrived carrying uncertainty in her lineage, the veil helped everyone pretend just a little longer. There's a mainstream historical fact that historians no longer debate. European royal families, especially between the 15th and 18th centuries, practiced extreme endogamy. The most infamous example, the Habsburgs, left behind portraits that look almost exaggerated, jutting jaws, elongated faces, fragile bodies. But before portraits were exchanged, before ambassadors whispered reports, the wedding ceremony itself was often the first real-world encounter. The veil bought time for vows to lock alliances in place before physical reality could complicate them. You can feel how tense that moment must have been. Under the veil could be signs of inherited illness, tremors, facial asymmetry, skin conditions, hearing loss. None of these made someone less human, but all of them made a royal marriage politically risky. A visibly imperfect bride could raise doubts about fertility, longevity, or divine favor. And doubts were dangerous. The veil functioned like a pause button on judgment, letting the ritual outrun scrutiny. There's a fringe but persistent tidbit that circulates in court gossip and later memoirs. Some royal brides were coached to move slowly, speak minimally, and avoid bright light until after the unveiling. The veil helped mask not just appearance, but behavior. If you imagine a bride trained to keep her eyes down, her face still, her breathing calm, not out of modesty, but to avoid revealing a neurological condition, you're not far off from what some courts feared. It's unsettling, and historians still argue whether these accounts reflect rare cases or a broader, unspoken practice. What's undeniable is that physical health mattered enormously, especially in women expected to produce heirs. A veil could soften visible scars from childhood illness, hide skin damaged by pox, or obscure facial differences that might alarm an already anxious groom. Even temporary conditions, fatigue, fever, stress-induced tremors, could be interpreted as permanent flaws. The veil created a grace period where interpretation was suspended, and interpretation was everything. Royal marriages were scrutinized like contracts with bodies as clauses. A bride's appearance was read as prophecy. Strong features suggested strong heirs. Weakness suggested instability. In that environment, concealment wasn't deception, it was strategy. Everyone involved understood the game, even if they pretended not to. The veil let them proceed without asking questions they didn't want answered too soon. You also start to notice how often language around these marriages avoided specifics. Chronic illness became delicacy. Disability became sensitivity. Mental health, when acknowledged at all, became melancholy or nervous temperament. The veil fit neatly into this culture of euphemism. It allowed silence to masquerade as dignity. And silence in royal courts was often the most powerful currency. There's a particular anxiety around fertility that you can almost feel radiating from historical accounts. A bride who looked too thin, too pale, too fragile might trigger panic. Would she survive childbirth? Would she produce heirs quickly enough? The veil helped delay that evaluation, pushing it past the point of no return. Once married, concern shifted from prevention to management. Better to handle problems privately than cancel a union publicly. Some scholars push back against this interpretation, arguing that veils were too impractical to serve as effective concealment and that portraits and reports would have revealed most issues beforehand. Others counter that portraits were idealized and reports biased, and that first impressions still mattered deeply. Historians still argue whether veiling functioned primarily as symbolic tradition or as a practical tool for managing dynastic risk, but the emotional logic behind it is hard to dismiss. As you stand there, imagining the veil finally lifting, you realize the danger wasn't just what might be seen, it was what couldn't be unseen. Once a flaw was visible, it became part of the political narrative. Wars, annulments, and succession crises could hinge on a single revealed detail. The veil didn't erase reality, but it postponed it, long enough for vows to harden into obligation. And in that postponement, you begin to understand something quietly tragic. The veil wasn't hiding monsters or shame, it was hiding human vulnerability in a system that had no patience for it. And that may be the most dangerous secret of all. You don't get to rest yet. The veil still hasn't loosened because now the danger shifts outward. It's no longer about spirits or bloodlines. It's about people who very much exist, who have names, knives, and reasons. As you step into the role of a political bride, you feel it immediately. You are walking into hostile territory, and everyone knows it, even if no one says it out loud. Royal marriages are diplomatic invasions disguised as celebrations. When a foreign princess crosses a border to marry into another dynasty, she doesn't arrive as a guest, she arrives as leverage. Her body represents treaties, ceasefires, land claims, and future heirs who might one day rule a place that currently resents her existence. In that context, a veil becomes less romantic and more tactical. It shields not just identity, but intent. There's a solid historical fact that underpins this fear. Foreign royal brides were often deeply unpopular with the local court and population. Think of Catherine de' Medici in France, Marie Antoinette in Austria, or Anne of Cleves in England. Even before they set foot in their new countries, rumours preceded them. Spies reported on their appearance, manners, and health. Pamphlets mocked them. Whispers questioned their loyalty. By the time the wedding procession began, hostility was already in the air. The veil acted as a buffer against that hostility. If you can't see the bride clearly, you can't fully project your hatred onto her yet. Anger needs a face. The veil delays personalization. It keeps resentment abstract, just long enough to get through the ceremony without incident. And that might sound flimsy, but when crowds gather and tensions run high, even a small delay can prevent violence. And violence was a real concern. There are documented cases of assassination attempts clustered around weddings, coronations, and public entries. Moments when rulers and their families were exposed. A foreign bride, especially one from a rival or recently hostile nation, was an easy target. Poisoned pins, cursed objects, staged accidents, these weren't rare fears, they were standard risk assessments. The veil reduced the window of opportunity, it limited eye contact, it prevented recognition from a distance, it forced attackers to get closer, and closeness increased the chance of being stopped. Here's a quirky but telling tidbit. Some veils were intentionally weighted or layered to restrict sudden movement, not just by the bride, but around her. The fabric created a slower, more controlled procession. You couldn't rush her easily. You couldn't grab and flee without tangling yourself in silk. It's the medieval equivalent of crowd control architecture, and yes, it worked often enough to keep being used. You also have to consider the bride's own awareness. She knew she was entering a court that might despise her. Letters from royal women repeatedly mention fear during public appearances, especially early on. The veil offered psychological protection as much as physical. Behind it, you could breathe without being stared through. You could hear insults without seeing the faces behind them. That distance mattered. It helped brides endure moments that might otherwise have broken them before the marriage even began. Some historians suggest that the veil's protective role was overstated, that real security came from guards and protocols. Others argue the opposite, that ritual protection and physical security were inseparable in pre-modern thinking. Historians still argue whether the veil was primarily symbolic reassurance or an active defensive measure, but in an age where belief shaped behavior, symbolism had real power. You notice how quickly the veil becomes a political object. Once the bride is married, the veil comes off, and so does some of her protection. She is now visible, accountable, and fully embedded in the court's power struggles. But during the ceremony itself, she exists in a protected bubble, untouchable, unknowable, temporarily neutral. That neutrality was precious. For a few hours, you were neither enemy nor ruler, neither threat nor ally, just a figure moving through ritual space. And in a world where everything was personal and nothing was forgiven easily, that temporary suspension of meaning could be the difference between survival and catastrophe. As you move onward, you realize the veil has become something like a diplomatic passport. It doesn't erase danger, but it grants safe passage through the most volatile moment of all, arrival. And once you see that, it becomes impossible to think of royal wedding veils as passive tradition ever again. They were active participants in high-stakes political theatre, quiet, elegant, and absolutely necessary. You don't feel the shift at first because the veil hasn't changed, but the meaning beneath it has. The danger now isn't outside threats or hidden bloodlines. It's judgment, intimate, invasive judgment, dressed up as morality and called tradition. As you move forward, you realize the veil is doing something deeply uncomfortable. It's staging a performance about virtue that everyone pretends is natural. Royal weddings were obsessed with virginity, not because of romance, but because of accounting. Virginity meant certainty. Certainty meant legitimate heirs. Legitimate heirs meant stability. Anything that threatened that chain of logic was treated like a crack in the foundation of the state. And you, under the veil, are the proof everyone wants, but no one is allowed to openly demand, at least not yet. There's a well-established historical fact here that often gets softened in retellings. In many royal and noble marriages, a bride's virginity was not merely assumed, it was scrutinized before and after the wedding, sometimes through testimony, sometimes through ritual, sometimes through, frankly, humiliating inspection by older women tasked with confirming what men were not supposed to discuss publicly. The veil played a key role in this theatre because it allowed the bride to be symbolically pure before she was physically verified. You can sense the tension in the room. Everyone is watching, but no one is looking directly. The veil turns the bride into an idea, untainted, untouched, compliant. It reassures onlookers before any evidence exists. That reassurance matters because once doubt enters the narrative, it's almost impossible to remove. The veil helps seal the story in advance. This woman arrives pure, therefore any future complications must come later. There's a strange, almost surreal tidbit that circulates in early modern court records and folklore. In some traditions, the veil was believed to contain virginity, like a fragile substance that could be lost through exposure. An unveiled bride was thought to risk contamination simply by being seen too closely. It sounds absurd now, but it reflects how physical and mystical ideas about the body blurred together. Purity wasn't just a condition, it was a state that needed guarding. Under the veil, you are protected from premature interpretation. People can't read your expressions, they can't assess your confidence, your fear, your experience. All of that would have been scrutinized mercilessly. A bride who moved too confidently risked suspicion. One who seemed too anxious risked pity. The veil flattened all those possibilities into a single, acceptable image: modest silence. This performance mattered because the consequences of failure were severe. Accusations of impurity could lead to annulment, exile, or worse. Even rumors could destabilize alliances. In that context, the veil wasn't about hiding sexuality, it was about controlling narrative timing. You are pure now, by definition. Proof comes later, when the contract is already signed. Historians still argue whether these rituals were primarily about controlling women's bodies or about managing male anxiety in patriarchal systems, and the uncomfortable answer is probably both. The veil reassured grooms, fathers, and entire courts that order was being maintained. It allowed them to believe in a system where lineage could be neatly traced, even when reality was far messier. You also begin to notice how uneven this scrutiny was. Grooms were rarely questioned. Their sexual histories were treated as irrelevant or even celebrated. The veil, in that sense, became a visual marker of imbalance. It announced who was being assessed and who was doing the assessing. And yet, paradoxically, it also offered the bride a thin layer of defense. Behind it, she could exist without being immediately dissected by the crowd. There's a subtle cruelty in how calm the ceremony appears. Music plays, vows are spoken, the veil glows softly in candlelight. And beneath it, a young woman carries the weight of expectations that have nothing to do with her and everything to do with the future of people she's just met. The veil doesn't create that burden, but it helps disguise it as grace. By the time the section ends, you understand something deeply unsettling. The veil didn't just hide danger, it helped manufacture certainty where none truly existed. It allowed belief to outrun evidence. And in royal history, belief, especially about women's bodies, has always been one of the most dangerous forces of all. You breathe in slowly because now the veil is no longer symbolic in some abstract way. It's practical, almost medical. The air around you feels thick, suspicious, and full of invisible threats. In this part of the story, danger isn't imagined or political. It's microbial, even if no one has the word for it yet. The veil becomes a filter in a world terrified of bad air. For centuries, disease is understood through the idea of miasma, the belief that illness spreads through foul smells and corrupted air. Plagues don't come from bacteria, they come from atmosphere gone wrong. Swamps, corpses, overcrowded cities, even strangers are thought to carry sickness on their breath. And royal brides, travelling long distances and entering unfamiliar environments, are walking vectors in both directions. The veil sits between lungs and world, a thin but meaningful line of defence. There's a mainstream historical fact that anchors this fear. During outbreaks of plague and other epidemics, veiling and face covering increased across Europe and parts of the Middle East. Physicians, clergy, and nobility alike used cloth barriers soaked in herbs or perfumes. While bridal veils weren't designed as medical equipment, they benefited from the same logic. A bride entering a crowded ceremony was exposed to hundreds of exhalations, and every one of them was suspect. You can almost smell it, the cloves, rosemary, myrrh, and rosewater sometimes woven into fabric or dabbed onto veils. This wasn't about scent alone, it was about purification. If disease travelled through smell, then pleasant smell repelled it. It sounds naive now, but it shaped behaviour in very real ways. A heavily perfumed veil wasn't just fashionable, it was preventative care, medieval style. Here's a quirky tidbit that feels oddly familiar in a post-mask world. Some brides reportedly complained about dizziness or shortness of breath under layered veils, especially when herbs were used heavily. The irony is thick. The very thing meant to protect you could make you feel faint. And yet, faintness itself was often interpreted as delicacy or virtue, so no one rushed to remove the fabric. Suffering, as usual, was aestheticized. The veil also served to protect others from the bride. Royal women arriving from foreign courts were feared as potential carriers of illness. Even without understanding pathogens, people noticed patterns. Strangers brought unfamiliar sickness. Covering the bride's face reduced the perceived risk of contagion during the most intimate public moment. It was quarantine theatre, staged in silk. Historians still argue whether veils meaningfully reduced disease transmission or simply offered psychological comfort. But psychological comfort matters in crises. Fear shapes behaviour, and behaviour shapes outcomes. If people believed the veil made the wedding safer, they acted calmer, more orderly, less prone to panic, and panic, in crowded medieval settings, could be deadly. You begin to see how this overlaps with earlier fears. Remember the evil eye. Disease and envy often blurred together. Both were invisible, both struck suddenly, both were blamed on proximity. The veil addressed all of it at once. It blocked breath, glances, and bad intentions in a single, elegant gesture. There's also the issue of the bride herself. Travel was brutal. Weeks or months on the road left people exhausted, malnourished, and vulnerable. A fever on arrival could spark rumours of plague and derail the entire marriage. The veil helped disguise early symptoms: flushed skin, laboured breathing, trembling lips, long enough to complete the ceremony. Again, delay was everything. Some scholars caution against overinterpreting this function, pointing out that most veils were too porous to stop disease. Others counter that in a world governed by belief, perceived protection was actionable protection. Historians still argue whether the veil's medical role was intentional or incidental, but the timing of its use during epidemics is difficult to ignore. As you move on, you realize the veil has quietly evolved into a multi-purpose defense system. It guards against spirits, enemies, judgment, and now sickness. Layer by layer, it absorbs fears that society doesn't know how to name yet. And in doing so, it becomes indispensable, not because it solves the problem, but because it gives everyone permission to proceed as if the problem has been handled. In a way, the veil is doing what humans have always done in the face of uncertainty, placing a barrier between themselves and the unknown, then trusting that barrier enough to keep moving forward. Whether that trust was justified is still up for debate, but without it, many royal weddings might never have happened at all. You sense it before anyone names it, because this fear doesn't need explanation. It hums in the background of every glance, every pause, every carefully neutral smile. The veil settles more deliberately now, as if everyone involved understands its most ancient job, deflecting envy sharp enough to kill. This is where superstition tightens its grip, and where the evil eye stops being metaphor and becomes an active threat. Across the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and much of Europe, belief in the evil eye is not fringe, it's mainstream. A look, especially one charged with jealousy or resentment, is thought to cause illness, infertility, madness, even death. Royal brides are prime targets: youth, beauty, fertility, status, all concentrated in one person on one day. You don't have to hate the bride to harm her, you just have to want what she has. There's a solid historical fact grounding this fear. Protective measures against the evil eye were embedded into daily life for centuries. Amulets, gestures, charms, spitting rituals, yes, actual spitting, were common defenses. Brides were layered in protection, and the veil was one of the most visible and socially acceptable tools. It didn't accuse anyone directly, it simply blocked access. You can almost feel the eyes on you as you walk. Some are curious, some are calculating. Some belong to women who understand exactly what you're losing today. Others belong to men who see power consolidating without them. The veil absorbs all of it. It softens gazes, blurs features, and denies the onlooker a clean, emotional target. You can't envy what you can't fully see. There's a strange, almost poetic tidbit that appears in folk explanations. The evil eye needs clarity to work. A sharp image creates a sharp effect. Blur weakens intention. That's why reflective surfaces, distorted glass, and fabric were all believed to interfere with harmful looks. The veil didn't just hide, it distorted. It turned a face into an impression, and impressions were harder to curse. This belief also explains why unveiling was often delayed until a controlled, private moment. You didn't want hundreds of eyes hitting you all at once. Even positive attention could be dangerous. Praise could curdle into envy. Admiration could trigger resentment. Better to ration visibility. Better to choose when and how you become fully seen. You notice how often historical accounts describe sudden misfortune shortly after weddings, miscarriages, unexplained illnesses, accidents. Whether coincidence or confirmation bias, people connected the dots. Someone must have looked too hard, someone must have wanted too much. The veil in hindsight hadn't been thick enough or lifted too soon. Historians still argue whether belief in the evil eye was primarily psychological, social, or genuinely spiritual, but its impact is undeniable. People acted on it. They structured ceremonies around it. They blamed it when things went wrong. And because royal marriages were public and symbolic, they attracted more eyes and therefore more danger than ordinary unions. You also realize something unsettling. The evil eye wasn't always external. Sometimes it came from within the court. Ladies in waiting, relatives, rivals, all close enough to see clearly, close enough to resent quietly. The veil created a boundary even there. It limited intimacy. It reminded everyone that the bride was not fully accessible yet. As you move forward, the veil feels less like cloth and more like a shield raised just in time. It doesn't stop envy from existing, but it stops it from landing cleanly. And in a world where misfortune needed explanation, that mattered more than truth. You're beginning to see the pattern now. Each fear layers onto the next, and the veil absorbs them all. Not because it's magical, but because belief, repeated for centuries, has a way of becoming real in its consequences. You feel the veil differently now. It's no longer something meant to stop others from reaching you. It's something meant to keep you from being seen at all, especially when what you're feeling would be unacceptable if exposed. Beneath the fabric, the danger isn't attack or illness, it's emotion, raw, inconvenient, uncontrollable emotion. Royal marriages are rarely negotiated with the bride's consent in mind. By the time you stand here, the decision has been made years ago, often before you understood what marriage even meant. You are being transferred politically, legally, socially, and everyone expects you to perform gratitude. The veil becomes your final refuge because it allows you to feel without being corrected. There is a mainstream historical fact that rarely gets emphasized. Letters and diaries from royal women frequently describe wedding days as moments of intense fear, grief, and dissociation rather than joy. Princesses wrote about shaking hands, nausea, sudden tears, and an overwhelming sense of finality. These accounts don't match the paintings. The veil helps explain the discrepancy. It lets the ceremony proceed while the bride quietly falls apart. Under the veil, you can cry softly, silently, without alarming the crowd. No one expects smiles yet. No one can see your mouth tighten or your eyes fill. This isn't a small mercy. Public emotional control was demanded of royal women at all times, and failure could be interpreted as instability or ingratitude. The veil creates a narrow emotional quarantine. There's a haunting little tidbit passed down in court anecdotes. Some brides were advised by older women to let the tears come early while still veiled, because once unveiled, every expression would be interpreted as character. Cry too late and you're weak. Cry too soon and you're dramatic. The veil is the only safe window. You start to understand how fear operated beneath the surface. Fear of the groom, often a stranger, fear of the marriage bed, fear of childbirth, fear of leaving home forever, fear of being trapped in a court that may never accept you. None of these fears fit into the official narrative of dynastic harmony, so they were hidden, literally, behind fabric. Historians still argue whether the veil functioned primarily as emotional protection or merely as ceremonial tradition, but the consistency of private accounts suggests something deeper. The veil appears again and again at the exact moment when emotional pressure peaks. That timing is not accidental. You also realize how isolating this must have been. Surrounded by people, yet completely alone. The veil muffles sound, narrows vision, and creates a strange sensory tunnel. Time slows. You are present, but not fully participating. For a frightened bride, that dissociation might have been the only way through. There's a cruel symmetry here. The veil protects the bride's emotions, but it also hides them, allowing everyone else to pretend they don't exist. No one has to confront the reality that this union may be unwanted, frightening, or traumatic. The ceremony remains intact. The illusion holds. As you move forward, the veil feels almost compassionate. Not kind exactly, but necessary. It allows a human reaction in an inhuman system, and that quietly may be one of the most dangerous secrets it was ever meant to conceal. You don't notice it at first, because the veil looks the same, but the energy around you has shifted. The danger now is subtler, wrapped in whispers and half-denials, the kind of thing no official record ever admits outright. This is where control replaces protection, and where the veil becomes a convenient cover for what should never need hiding. Royal weddings were exhausting ordeals. Long processions, fasting, prayer, travel, hours of standing still under heat and scrutiny. Brides were expected to endure all of it without faltering. And sometimes endurance was chemically assisted. There's a mainstream historical fact that often surprises modern audiences. Sedatives and calming substances were widely used in pre-modern medicine, prescribed especially for women. Laudanum, herbal opiates, wine-based tonics. These weren't fringe remedies, they were common. Now imagine a young bride, anxious, sleepless, possibly terrified, being given something to steady her nerves, not enough to render her unconscious, just enough to dull panic. Under the veil, no one can see glazed eyes, slowed reactions, or unfocused gazes. The ceremony proceeds smoothly. The bride complies. Everyone congratulates themselves on a successful union. There's a controversial but persistent tidbit found in scattered letters and later recollections. Some brides were intentionally calmed to prevent resistance, emotional or physical, during the transition from ceremony to consummation. The veil made this easier. If the bride seemed distant or passive, it could be attributed to modesty, fatigue, or nerves. Historians still argue whether these practices were rare abuses or quietly normalized safeguards, but the ambiguity itself is telling. You feel the loss of agency here most sharply. Earlier, the veil shielded you from danger. Now, it shields others from accountability. It prevents questions. It smooths over discomfort. If something feels wrong, the fabric absorbs the evidence. The language used around these substances is always gentle, soothing, restorative, for her own good. But control often hides behind kindness. The veil ensures that outward appearances align with expectations, even if the inner experience is fragmented or foggy. You also start to see how this connects back to earlier sections. Remember the fear of emotional display, the demand for purity, the need for compliance? Sedation solves all of those problems at once. A calm bride doesn't cry. A subdued bride doesn't resist. A quiet bride doesn't complicate politics. Some scholars caution against drawing firm conclusions, noting that evidence is indirect and inconsistent. Others argue that the very lack of documentation is the point. These were practices no one wanted recorded. Historians still argue whether chemical control was an exception or an unspoken norm in certain courts, but the veil's role in enabling plausible deniability is hard to ignore. As you move on, the veil feels colder. It's no longer just a barrier between you and the world, it's a curtain drawn over consent itself. And once you see that, it becomes impossible to pretend this tradition was ever purely innocent. You're still moving, still veiled, but now the danger is almost painfully visual. This is the moment where appearance becomes currency, where a face can tip negotiations one way or another. The veil tightens its role, not as protection from harm, but as a filter, carefully controlling what reality is allowed to arrive on time. Royal marriages were markets, not metaphorically, literally. Brides were evaluated like assets, with youth, beauty, and physical symmetry standing in for prosperity and divine favor. A good-looking bride promised healthy heirs and strong alliances. A bride who failed to impress visually could weaken her position before she ever spoke a word. The veil slowed that reckoning. There's a clear historical fact anchoring this anxiety. Smallpox, measles, and other childhood diseases left visible scars on a massive portion of the population, including royalty. Pockmarks, uneven skin texture, damaged eyesight, these were common, not exceptional. Portraits hid them, makeup softened them, and wedding veils delayed their discovery until vows had already bound families together. You can feel the calculation behind the fabric. This isn't about shame, it's about timing. A scar revealed too early could invite ridicule or rejection. Revealed later, it became a private inconvenience rather than a public flaw. The veil gave alliances momentum. Once momentum existed, appearance mattered less. There's a quietly unsettling tidbit buried in court etiquette manuals. Brides were often instructed on lighting, posture, and unveiling angles to present their best aspect. This wasn't vanity, it was survival strategy. If your face would be judged anyway, better to control the conditions. The veil allowed for a choreographed reveal rather than an uncontrolled exposure. Age was another secret quietly managed. Some brides were younger or older than advertised. In an era without standardized records, physical appearance carried enormous evidentiary weight. A veil softened wrinkles, blurred lines, obscured proportions. You could be almost anyone beneath it, and that ambiguity worked in your favor. Historians still argue whether veiling was primarily defensive against cruelty or complicit in unrealistic standards, and the truth likely sits uncomfortably between the two. The veil protected brides from instant dismissal, but it also reinforced the idea that their value rested in how they looked once revealed. You start to notice how unveiling moments are described in sources with language that borders on suspense, gasps, murmurs, relief, disappointment. These reactions mattered. They shaped how a bride was treated in her new court from that moment forward. The veil delayed that verdict, but it couldn't prevent it. And yet delay mattered. A day, an hour, even a few minutes could transform a woman from negotiable to non-negotiable. Once married, flaws were managed privately. Before marriage, they were liabilities. The veil bridged that gap with silk and ritual. As you move on, the pattern sharpens again. The veil keeps doing the same thing over and over. It buys time. Time to lock contracts. Time to stabilize power. Time to turn human imperfection into something everyone agrees not to mention out loud. You slow your pace now because this is the moment everyone has been waiting for, the moment when the veil is supposed to come up. And somehow, this is where the danger peaks, not before, not after. Right here, balance between concealment and exposure, where one movement can change everything. Unveiling was never casual. It was ritualized, delayed, and carefully staged because the consequences were unpredictable. There's a straightforward historical fact that underlines this tension. In many royal traditions, the groom was not permitted to see the bride's face fully until after vows were exchanged. This wasn't universal, but it was common enough to shape ceremony design. The reveal wasn't romance, it was risk management. You can almost feel the collective intake of breath when the veil begins to lift. This is where alliances either settle or start to fracture. If the bride matched expectations, relief washed through the room. If she didn't, if she looked ill, older, frightened, or simply not impressive enough, the shift could be immediate and brutal. Public disappointment was dangerous. It humiliated families. It invited gossip. It sometimes justified cruelty. There's a chilling tidbit buried in anecdotal histories. Some marriages were emotionally over the moment the veil lifted. The ceremony continued, but the bride's standing never recovered. Coldness, neglect, or humiliation followed, not because she'd done anything wrong, but because she had failed to meet an unspoken visual contract. The veil delayed that verdict, but it couldn't erase it. You start to see how much power rested in that single gesture. Lifting the veil wasn't just revealing a face, it was confirming or denying a future. That's why the timing mattered so much. Reveal too early and rejection could halt proceedings. Reveal too late and resentment could fester. The sweet spot was narrow and heavily guarded by tradition. Historians still argue whether unveiling rituals protected brides from immediate harm or simply postponed inevitable judgment. And the evidence supports both views. Some brides benefited from the delay, others suffered more intensely once expectations collapsed. The veil wasn't a guarantee, it was a gamble. There's also the groom's vulnerability to consider. Unveiling forced him to react in public. Surprise, disappointment, delight. Whatever crossed his face would be read by everyone. That pressure sometimes produced cruelty. Better to assert dominance than admit regret. Better to control the narrative than reveal uncertainty. You realize now why veils were sometimes lifted in private spaces, away from crowds. Damage control. If the reveal was less than ideal, at least the reaction wouldn't be public. Even kings needed privacy when faced with disappointment. As the veil finally lifts, the room exhales, but the story doesn't resolve. It fractures. From this moment on, the bride is fully visible, fully accountable, and fully embedded in the court's power struggles. Protection recedes, expectation takes over. You move on knowing this. The most dangerous moment in a royal wedding was never the procession or the vows. It was the reveal. Because once the veil lifted, there was no longer any buffer between reality and consequence. You don't get relief after the unveiling. If anything, the pressure sharpens, because now the veil's work becomes psychological rather than physical. This is where male anxiety enters fully, quietly shaping tradition while pretending not to exist. The veil, you begin to see, was never only about protecting the bride. It was also about calming the men who needed to believe they were in control. Royal men lived with a constant, gnawing fear, uncertainty of lineage. Power passed through blood, and blood had to be traceable, unquestioned, uncontaminated. A single rumour could fracture succession. A single doubt could ignite war. The veil stepped into that fear long before words ever did, offering reassurance before proof. There's a mainstream historical fact that grounds this unease. Royal succession crises were among the most common causes of civil war in pre-modern Europe. Disputed paternity, contested heirs, whispered illegitimacy. These weren't abstract concerns. They were existential threats. The veil functioned as a symbolic seal, marking the bride as untouched at the moment she entered the lineage. You notice how often unveiling coincides with transfer of ownership language. She is given, received, taken into the house. The veil acts like packaging. Before it's removed, the contents are assumed intact. Once removed, responsibility transfers. If something goes wrong later, blame can be reassigned to fate, to the bride, to God, but never to the system itself. There's a telling tidbit buried in early legal customs. In some regions, the groom was expected to lift the veil himself, publicly claiming what lay beneath. This wasn't tenderness, it was assertion, a visual declaration that uncertainty was over and authority had begun. The veil made that moment possible by concentrating all anxiety into a single, controlled act. Historians still argue whether these rituals soothed male insecurity or actively reinforced patriarchal dominance. But the overlap is obvious. Reassurance and control often wear the same clothes. The veil allowed men to believe order was being maintained, even when biology and reality refused to cooperate. You start to see how uneven the burden was. If heirs failed to appear, suspicion often fell on the woman, her health, her body, her supposed impurity, rarely on the man. The veil had already done its job by establishing a narrative of initial certainty. Any later failure could be reframed as deviation, not doubt. As you move forward, the veil feels almost like a contract clause no one admits writing. It doesn't guarantee outcomes, but it creates a starting point that favors power over truth. And in royal history, that imbalance has always shaped whose fears mattered most. You leave this section understanding something quietly corrosive. The veil didn't just hide danger, it redistributed it. It shifted anxiety away from men who ruled and onto women who bore the consequences. You feel the tone change again, softer on the surface but sharper underneath, because now the veil is caught in an argument that never really ends. This is where religion steps forward with symbols and scripture, insisting it was always in charge, while reality quietly clears its throat in the background. Faith speaks in absolutes, life does not. The veil lives in the space between them. Religious explanations for veiling sound clean and elevated: humility before God, sacred modesty, submission to divine order. These ideas appear in Christian, Jewish, and Islamic traditions, each insisting the veil protects holiness rather than fear. And to be fair, there is a mainstream historical fact here. Religious authorities did formally codify veiling practices, embedding them into marriage rites and moral teaching. By the medieval period, the veil had become theologically respectable. But theology rarely invents from nothing. It absorbs what already works. The veil's earlier jobs, blocking danger, delaying judgment, managing anxiety, didn't disappear when religion claimed it. They were baptized, metaphorically speaking. A practice born from fear of spirits, disease, envy, and politics was reframed as obedience to God. That reframing made it harder to question. You can feel the contradiction if you sit with it long enough. If the veil is about humility, why is it used most aggressively in the highest status marriages? If it's about modesty, why is it lifted so theatrically? These aren't flaws in logic, they're clues. Religion didn't erase the veil's practical functions, it gave them cover. There's a curious tidbit buried in sermon literature and marriage manuals. Clergy often warned that improper veiling could invite misfortune, not sin, misfortune, illness, discord, barrenness. The language slips. Even when framed as spiritual duty, the threat lurking behind it is still danger in very earthly forms. Historians still argue whether religious symbolism genuinely transformed the meaning of veils or merely layered justification over older fears. Some see sincere belief reshaping tradition, others see institutional convenience. When a ritual calms people, enforces order, and reduces conflict, it tends to get divine endorsement. You also notice how selectively religion applied its concern. Brides were veiled, grooms were not. The imbalance was explained as moral difference, but it functioned as risk management. Women carried the visible burden of uncertainty, fertility, lineage, temptation, and religion offered a framework that made that burden feel righteous rather than imposed. As you move forward, the veil no longer feels like a lie exactly. It feels like a translation. Fear translated into faith, control translated into virtue, practical danger translated into moral instruction. And once translated, it became harder to peel back the layers and see the original reasons underneath. This is where the veil becomes most powerful, not when it hides a face, but when it hides its own history. You almost expect the veil to feel lighter now because so many of the dangers you've passed through are fading. Plagues recede, assassinations become rarer, bloodlines spread wider, science starts naming things fear used to explain. And yet the veil doesn't disappear, it lingers. That's how you know you've reached the strange part of the story, the part where a tradition outlives the threats that created it. By the late 18th and 19th centuries, royal weddings begin to look more familiar to modern eyes. White dresses gain popularity, churches brighten, processions become carefully photographed instead of nervously guarded. On paper, the need for veils as protection should be shrinking, and historically it does, at least in practice. There's a clear mainstream fact here. By the Victorian era, the veil's stated purpose had largely shifted from protection to symbolism, emphasizing modesty, femininity, and decorum rather than danger. But symbolism is rarely neutral. When something survives long after its original function fades, it's usually because it still does quiet work in the background. The veil may no longer be blocking curses or assassins, but it continues to manage perception. It softens, it delays, it creates a moment of controlled revelation, and people, especially powerful institutions, are reluctant to give that up. You notice how language changes before the ritual does. Fear-based explanations fall out of fashion, replaced by romance. The veil is now said to heighten mystery, build anticipation, create beauty, which sounds lovely until you realize it's the same logic as before, just repackaged. Mystery once kept brides safe. Now it keeps audiences engaged. The mechanism is identical. The justification is prettier. There's a fascinating, slightly ironic tidbit from 19th century etiquette manuals. Some writers complained that veils were becoming too thick, too theatrical, too dramatic. They worried brides were overdoing modesty. That anxiety reveals something important. When the original dangers faded, people didn't remove the veil. They debated how opaque it should be. The instinct to obscure never fully left. Historians still argue whether this period represents the veil's true transformation or merely its rebranding. Some see a genuine shift toward aesthetic tradition, driven by Queen Victoria's influential wedding in 1840. Others point out that Victorian society was deeply anxious about female sexuality, reputation, and public visibility. Anxiety the veil still helped manage. Different fear, same tool. You begin to see how the veil becomes a kind of social fossil. The threats that shaped it are gone, but their outlinings remain. The ceremony still treats the bride's appearance as a moment that must be delayed, curated, and unveiled on cue. The bride is still the spectacle, still the variable, still the one whose visibility requires management. And because the original reasons are no longer spoken, the veil becomes harder to question. If you say it's about beauty, who argues? If you say it's tradition, who dares challenge centuries? That's how rituals become untouchable, not by being logical, but by being old. You also notice something else happening during this era. The veil starts to spread beyond royalty. As middle classes emulate aristocratic customs, the veil trickles down. What was once about dynastic risk becomes aspirational. People copy the look without inheriting the danger. The symbol detaches from its source and floats free, light enough to land anywhere. Yet even then, traces of the old fear peek through. Brides are still told not to be seen by the groom before the ceremony. Bad luck, they say. Brides are still encouraged to keep calm, quiet, composed, still warned against showing too much emotion, still framed as something precious that could be spoiled by premature exposure. The language changes, but the structure holds. Some scholars argue this is simply how culture works. Rituals evolve, meanings shift, nothing sinister required. Others point out that when a practice consistently centers control over one group's visibility and not another's, it's worth asking why. Historians still argue whether the modern veil is an empty tradition or a relic quietly enforcing old expectations, and the answer likely depends on who's wearing it and why. As you stand here on the edge of modernity, the veil feels almost weightless. No longer armor, no longer shield, but it still shapes behavior, still signals transition, still marks the bride as someone entering a role that requires adjustment, restraint, and performance. You're close to the end now, and the pattern is clear. The veil didn't lose its power when danger faded. It simply learned how to hide its purpose better. You arrive at the present without fanfare, because that's how the most persistent traditions survive. They don't announce themselves. They simply keep going. The veil still floats, still waits, still lifts on cue, even though most people watching can no longer explain why it's there without reaching for words like romance or tradition. But you know better now. You've followed the thread all the way here, and it hasn't snapped. Modern royal weddings insist they're different, safer, freer, chosen, and in many ways that's true. Brides today are adults with voices, contracts, lawyers, and public platforms. The threats that once demanded concealment, assassins, plagues, dynastic collapse, are mostly gone, and yet the veil remains quietly doing what it has always done, shaping perception. There's a contemporary historical fact worth sitting with for a moment. In modern royal ceremonies, the veil is often discussed more than the vows. Its length, its lace, who designed it, how long it trailed behind the bride. Cameras linger on it. Commentators speculate about symbolism. The bride's face, meanwhile, is delayed, still withheld, still controlled. The structure hasn't changed nearly as much as the language around it. You can feel the echo of older dangers here. The veil still manages anticipation. It still creates a reveal. It still turns a woman into a moment rather than a constant presence. That doesn't mean modern brides are victims, but it does mean the ritual hasn't fully let go of its past. It's carrying centuries of anxiety in sheer fabric and calling it elegance. There's a quietly unsettling modern tidbit. Brides who choose not to wear veils at high-profile weddings are often described as bold, unconventional, or making a statement, which raises the obvious question: why does not hiding still feel like rebellion? Historians still argue whether the veil today is purely optional symbolism or a social expectation disguised as choice, and the reactions to its absence suggest the debate isn't settled. You also notice how the veil still absorbs emotion. Brides cry behind it, steady themselves behind it, take one last breath behind it before stepping into a role that will define how they're spoken about forever. Cameras don't catch that moment clearly, and maybe that's the point. Some protections never quite go away, even when we no longer name them as such. And then there's the audience, you, watching. You're conditioned to wait for the lift, to feel that tiny rush when it happens. That's not accidental. The veil still controls the narrative, still dictates when intimacy is allowed, still decides when the bride becomes fully visible. The danger is no longer physical, but it's still psychological, cultural, and deeply ingrained. By now, you understand the secret isn't that royal wedding veils hid danger, it's that they were designed to. They evolved to manage fear, judgment, control, and vulnerability long before romance ever entered the conversation. What we see today is a softened version of something once sharp, but softness doesn't mean harmless, and as the ceremony ends and the veil finally comes away, you're left with a strange calm, not suspicion, not outrage, just awareness, because once you've seen how traditions are built, layer by layer, fear by fear, you don't have to reject them to understand them. You just stop mistaking them for innocence. Your breathing slows now because there's nothing left to uncover. The silk settles. The noise fades. All those centuries of fear, control, belief, and protection dissolve into something quieter, almost human. You imagine the veil folded away, resting at last, no longer needed to block danger or manage expectations. The faces behind it are just faces again, ordinary, safe. The stories lose their edge, becoming history instead of warning. You're still here, still listening, still perfectly fine. Nothing followed you out of the past. Nothing is watching. So let your shoulders drop. Let the images blur. And let sleep take over gently, knowing that even the most dangerous secrets eventually soften into memory.